Good morning. Welcome to another edition of Chemistry on the Fly with Mr. F. Today we're going to talk about chemistry of food 7.15. Yesterday we learned about what we are made of. It turns out we're made out of schnapps. CHNOPS, or carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, and sulfur. And we also learned yesterday that we are made up of different proportions of those. So oxygen, we're made out of 65%. That's the most of any of them. Then we've got carbon, and then hydrogen, and then we've got a little bit of nitrogen, and then even less of phosphorus, and then a teeny bit of sulfur, and then the last is the trace elements. And of course, all of those percentages are by mass. Now, where do all of these schnapps plus the trace elements come from? Well, it turns out they come from what we breathe, what we eat, and, of course, what we drink. Now, we can't control too much about what we breathe, although lately with the coronavirus, we do have to pay attention to who we're around so we don't breathe in the coronavirus. That wouldn't be a good thing for us. But we can control what we eat and what we drink. So we're going to focus on both of those today. So there are three types of food and drink that we can consume. Okay, the first one's carbohydrates, the second one is proteins, and then the last one is fats or lipids. Now, I tend to use the word fats, but scientists tend to use the word lipids. And then also when we get to carbohydrates, I tend to use just carbs because it's an easier word to say. And so if I say carbs, I mean carbohydrates. So we're going to break down each one of those individually. So let's look at carbs or carbohydrates first. So the first thing we're going to look at is where these carbohydrates come from. So they're going to be in breads and pastas and grains and cereals, potatoes, corn, fruits, sweets, pop. I didn't put these on the list, but donuts and candy and cakes and cookies, they all belong in this list as well. So carbohydrates are good for us, we'll find out, but I believe too many carbohydrates in our diet today is really what's causing us to be so overweight as a nation. That's my own little theory. Okay, types of carbohydrates. I'm going to break this down into three. There are saccharides, which is really just a scientific name or fancy name for sugars. Then there are going to be starches and fibers. Okay, the role. What is the role of carbohydrates? The big role for carbohydrates is energy. And then as carbohydrates, this is our main source of fuel for our bodies. Okay, we need them for physical activities like running around and doing whatever we do, brain function, operations of the organs, and operations of our heart and other things, even though heart's not an organ, that's a muscle. But all of those things rely heavily on carbohydrates. Now, each of our carbohydrates, or each type, is going to have a certain amount of energy stored within the food. Now, it's kind of like we talked about fuel the other day in our combustion reactions. Well, if we cook something on the grill, we're going to use propane as our fuel. Well, it turns out that when we use energy in our bodies, we're going to have carbohydrates or sugars are going to be our fuel. And we all have potential energy. So just like propane sitting by itself has the energy or potential to do stuff, same with our food. It doesn't really do much good for us unless we actually eat it. And carbohydrates have 4 calories per gram of carbs. Now what that calories is a measure of is energy. So they have a certain amount of stored energy or potential energy in our food. So if you have a piece of bread, you will have a certain amount of stored energy within that bread before you eat it. And then our body then will break it down and then use that energy. So remember that number, 4 calories for carbs, because we're going to come up with, compare with the proteins and the fats in a little bit. All right, so speaking of proteins, let's look at proteins next. So proteins are going to come in the form of fish and eggs and poultry and pork and red meat and nuts and vegetables, cheese and tofu. Now, I'm not a big fan of tofu, but apparently it has a fair amount of protein in it. Okay, the types of proteins. Now, proteins, we'll find out, do a huge amount of stuff within our bodies. So they do, I put a list here together. They are good for hormones and enzymes and structures and defense and storage and transportation and receptors and contractiles. These are just compression of things or combining things. So these proteins do a huge amount of stuff in our bodies. So there's a whole bunch of different types of things that they do. Now, what's the main role? I broke this down to be something really, really simple. They basically support the growth and maintenance of all parts of our body. That includes the smallest parts in our cells, and all the way up to some of the bigger parts in our tissues and our muscles and our brains. So all of those things are really critical about proteins. And one of the things we need to know about proteins is that they're made out of small little parts called amino acids. We picked that up a little bit yesterday. We'll focus on that again a little bit later in the school year. All right, potential energy for proteins. This happens to have the same amount of calories per gram as carbs do. So they have 4 calories per gram of energy. Let's look at fats and lipids. Now, fats or lipids have gotten kind of a bad name. I'll probably use the word fats more often. Most people for a while, they were saying, most dietitian people were saying, hey, you know what? Fats are bad for you. All fats, we have to cut down on fats. And what they ended up doing is cutting down on the fats, and then people would say, I don't like this stuff without fats. So they replaced the fats to make it better, at least taste better. They threw in a whole bunch more carbs. And again, my theory is that the carbs, extra carbs in our diet is what's making everybody so overweight these days. But fats in general, some of them are bad, and we'll talk about that in a second. But fats in general are not that bad for us. Okay, they come in the form of milk and cheese and meats and butter and olives, avocados, fried foods, and oils. Again, everything in moderation. Now, there are 4 types of fats, and they're going to be saturated fats, monounsaturated fats, polyunsaturated fats, and then trans fats. Now, of this list of 4, the first 3 are okay in moderation. We're not going to have a whole diet of fats. That's certainly not going to be good for us. But the one that is bad for us is called trans fats. And this is a fat that's actually manufactured. It's actually synthetic, where scientists have actually put extra hydrogens into fats, and they make them really not good for us. Our body really does not have any idea what to do with them, so they are not good for us. And most manufacturers today have at least reduced the amount of trans fats that we have in our diet, which is a good thing. So let's look at the role of fats. Okay, remember the role of fats is to store energy for future use. Now, in the old days, when we were hunter-gatherers and we didn't eat as much in the wintertime because there wasn't as much food, we would then store fat in the late fall, and then we would store it for the winter, and then our bodies wouldn't get the carbohydrates, so it would end up using fats to survive through the winter. Now, obviously, we eat all the time now. We don't have to worry about that near as much as we used to. But we still have that mechanism in our system that will take extra carbs and then store them as fats, and that's what's happening in the American diet these days. That's what I believe, anyway. And some of the other things that fats do for us, they do send signals and they hold cells together. And even there's another thing that's not here, is that some vitamins that are important to us are called fat soluble, and we won't accept them if we don't have any fat in our system. Okay, and then one of the things that's interesting about fats is that they are insoluble in water. So what that means is that if we put a fat, like we should know that if we put oil and water together, they don't mix. Well, most fats are going to be not soluble in water. And then here's the difference, or one of the differences, is the potential energy of fats. And maybe this is where people got the idea that fats were bad for us, is that fats actually have 9 calories per gram of fat instead of 4 like the other two. So I think scientists, right or wrong, were thinking, hey, let's get rid of fats because then our Americans will be eating less calories. But again, Americans didn't like the taste of foods without fat. So what they ended up doing is food manufacturers ended up putting a whole bunch more carbs in. So they still got the same calories, it's just in a different form. So again, that's a little bit of my theory on why Americans are heavier now than they should be. All right, so let's look at energy of food. And then here is a picture of a Doritos package. Now, it's not very clear right now, and I'm not sure why, but just have to take my word for it. So we're going to look at a package of Doritos, and if you could read this, it says this little package has 12 chips in it, which is not a whole lot for me. I would eat probably 4 or 5 bags of these if they were available. And this is a part of the processed foods that I try to avoid, and I think it's a good idea for everyone to do that. So let's make a little table up here. Okay, so we're going to put in this table, we're going to put carbs, proteins, fats, and total. And we're going to write down our conversion factors. Now, this is what we're converting. We want to figure out how many calories are we getting in carbs, how many calories in proteins, and how many calories we get fats. So we have our 4 calories per gram of carbs, 4 calories per gram of protein, and 9 calories per gram of fat. Now, if we could read this label better, we would see that this number tells us the number of carbs, and you're going to have to believe me here, is that this says it's 18 grams of carbs in this little package of Doritos. If we look at this part here, you'll have to believe me again, that says that it's 2 grams of protein. And then lastly, we have up here, we have 8 grams of fat. Now, if we do the math here, we multiply 18 times 4, and remember the way we did this before, we put our known values over 1, so then we could then keep that on the numerator, and then we were able to cancel out our grams of carbs on the numerator and the denominator and get rid of that. Now, I forgot to do that here, but you'll understand that. So we have 18 times 4 is 72, and we have calories. So 72 calories for carbs. Do the same thing for protein. We have 2 times 4 is 8. And then for our fats, we have 8 times 9 is 72. And lo and behold, we add these two numbers together and we get 150 calories. And again, that's exactly what the manufacturer of Doritos says. Now, I'm not a big fan of eating processed foods, so what I would suggest that we do is eat more broccoli and stay safe and strong. That's all I've got for today, guys. And as always, have a great day.